always said Porsha ate coochie. But listen, here's the thing. But it just put me in the mind frame of like, wasn't she preaching back in the day against LGBTQism? Didn't she preach and say it was against God the whole time? And now you considering whether or not you should be with a woman? These women better hide their purses out here for real. Hide your Birkins. She gonna take them. Go ahead, Porsha.
For years, whispers floated quietly through the reality TV world. For years, rumors festered in private conversations, backstage hallways, and industry group chats. And for years, those whispers stayed exactly where they were, unspoken, unconfirmed, and safely buried beneath carefully curated public images. Until now, because suddenly, everything feels different. Just days after Porsha Williams publicly opened up about questioning her sexuality, celebrating what many fans called growth, healing, and emotional honesty, the internet erupted in a way that felt less like applause and more like alarm. What was supposed to be a moment of vulnerability quickly turned into a catalyst, unlocking years of old footage, resurfaced screenshots, and long-dormant rumors that refused to stay quiet any longer. And at the center of it all sits one uncomfortable reality. When stories have been whispered for years and someone finally opens the door, even slightly, everything waiting behind it rushes out at once. This isn't just gossip anymore. This is about credibility, contradiction, and why silence sometimes speaks louder than denial. Porsha Williams has spent years crafting an image of resilience. No matter the scandal, the divorce, or the public fallout, she has consistently positioned herself as a woman who survives, reflects, and comes back stronger. That narrative has served her well, especially in a reality TV landscape where vulnerability often translates into relevance. So when Porsha recently spoke openly about questioning her sexuality, many fans saw it as a continuation of that arc. She spoke about loneliness, about emotional exhaustion, about feeling disconnected from men after her marriage ended. She admitted to sitting with herself, choosing solitude, and trying to heal before allowing anyone else into her life again. On the surface, it sounded raw, honest, human. She talked about crying, about feeling lost, about questioning whether she could even connect with anyone anymore. She framed her experience as part of a broader healing journey, one where she stops chasing relationships and starts confronting herself. And for a moment, the internet responded exactly as expected. Clips went viral, supporters praised her vulnerability, comment sections filled with encouragement, empathy, and declarations of growth. But not everyone was convinced, because while fans were focused on what Porsha was saying, others were paying closer attention to when she was saying it and why now. Almost immediately, critics began pointing out that this conversation didn't exist in a vacuum. Whispers about Porsha Williams' private life, particularly alleged relationships with women, had circulated quietly for years. They weren't new, they weren't fresh, they were simply ignored, dismissed, or overshadowed by louder scandals. And once Porsha framed her moment as self-discovery, those old whispers resurfaced with renewed intensity. People started digging. Old reality show clips were re-watched with new eyes. Party footage, once dismissed as playful, suddenly seemed more suggestive. Jokes that previously felt harmless were now examined as possible puzzle pieces in a much larger picture. Screenshots resurfaced. Archived interviews were dissected, and slowly a pattern emerged, one that some critics say paints a very different story from the one currently being told. This is where the tone shifted, because what began as a conversation about identity started to feel, to some, like narrative management. Then came Tasha K. Known for her provocative commentary and willingness to push boundaries, Tasha didn't frame Porsha's revelation as brave or healing. She framed it as overdue. In her view, this wasn't a breakthrough, it was a strategic pivot. Tasha openly questioned why sexuality was suddenly being introduced into the conversation after years of avoiding similar rumors. Her commentary wasn't subtle, it was sharp, skeptical, and unapologetic. She suggested that what was being framed as personal growth might actually be an attempt to rebrand long-standing whispers into a sympathetic narrative. Critics of Tasha immediately accused her of clout chasing, pointing to her history of controversial claims and legal trouble. Supporters, however, argued that this situation felt different, not because of who was speaking, but because of how much old material suddenly aligned. According to Tasha and others echoing her sentiment, this wasn't about curiosity, it was about consistency. And consistency, when it comes to rumors, is dangerous. What truly ignited the controversy wasn't speculation, it was contrast. Archived footage from Porsha Williams' earlier reality TV days began circulating again, showing her delivering sermons that framed LGBTQ identities as something to pray over, correct, or save. In those moments, her language was firm, religious, and uncompromising. The juxtaposition was striking. On one side, present-day Porsha speaks about fluidity, loneliness, and openness. On the other, past Porsha condemns the very identities she now appears to be questioning or embracing. Side-by-side comparisons flooded social media. Comment sections erupted with the same question repeated endlessly: which version is real? Supporters argued that people evolve, beliefs change, and growth isn't linear. Critics pushed back just as strongly, insisting that growth requires acknowledgement and that accountability demands clarity. And yet, no explanation came. As if the contradiction wasn't enough, the conversation took a far darker turn when allegations involving health risks and transparency began circulating. Tasha K and others hinted at concerns allegedly raised within Porsha's inner circle, not just about infidelity, but about disclosure and responsibility. To be clear, no documents have surfaced, no medical records have been released, nothing has been proven. But the accusation alone changed the temperature of the conversation, because once rumors shift from who someone loves to whether others were potentially put at risk, the stakes escalate dramatically. This stopped being about sexuality, it became about trust. Sources claimed that concerns were allegedly raised privately and dismissed, that questions about transparency were ignored or downplayed. Again, none of this has been verified, but the consistency of the claims is what made people pause. And once responsibility enters the conversation, silence becomes far more conspicuous. What happened next might be the most telling part of this entire saga. Nothing. No aggressive denials, no cease and desist letters, no lawsuits, no clarifying statements, just silence. Media analysts note that this type of silence is rarely accidental. In high-profile situations, silence can be strategic, especially when allegations are complex, layered, and potentially risky to address publicly. If the claims were entirely false, critics argue, a swift and firm denial would be expected. If evidence were weak, corrections would be loud. Instead, the absence of response only fueled speculation, and the internet, as always, filled in the gaps. People re-watched episodes, they rechecked timelines, they compared language from then and now, and what stood out wasn't chaos, it was selectivity. Emotional framing replaced hard facts, vulnerability replaced accountability. Once audiences feel manipulated, trust erodes quickly. At this point, the conversation has split sharply into two camps. One side believes this is nothing more than recycled rumors amplified by clout-hungry commentators. They argue that Porsha owes no one explanations about her identity, and that silence is a reasonable response to bad faith speculation. The other side insists this situation feels different, not louder, not messier, but heavier, because it didn't start with a leak, it started with Porsha herself opening the door, and once that door cracked, people rushed in with receipts. Old footage, archived interviews, reality show moments that now read differently. However, this is no longer just a conversation about identity. It's about trust, transparency, and why silence, especially now, feels louder than any denial ever could. In her own words, Porsha Williams described a deeply personal and introspective moment in her life. She explained that she had narrowed her romantic focus down to just two people, one man and one woman, and emphasized that both were kind, respectful, and seemingly safe. What stood out most, however, wasn't the gender of the people involved, but her admission that she struggled to open up precisely because they were not narcissists. According to her, therapy helped her recognize that emotional stability felt unfamiliar after years of unhealthy dynamics. She spoke openly about loneliness following her marriage, explaining that she no longer felt connected to men in the same way. People attempted to introduce her to new potential partners, but nothing clicked. The connection wasn't there. Instead of forcing herself back into dating, she said she made a conscious decision to be alone, to sit with herself, to sit with the loss, and to avoid repeating old mistakes before she felt whole again. She admitted that after heartbreak, you reach a point where you don't like anyone, where you question everything, including yourself. She openly questioned whether she even liked women, whether a woman could fill the emotional void she felt, whether anyone could. She described crying, feeling lonely daily, yet also feeling stronger with each passing day. On the surface, her words sounded raw, unfiltered, and deeply human, and initially the internet responded with overwhelming support. While fans praised Porsha for her honesty and vulnerability, others weren't convinced that what they were witnessing was purely self-discovery. Almost immediately, critics began asking a harder, more uncomfortable question. Was this truly healing, or was it damage control wrapped in emotional language? According to claims now circulating online, Porsha's so-called awakening was not sudden or new. Sources allege that it was less of a revelation and more of a carefully timed soft reveal, an introduction to a double life that had allegedly been unfolding quietly for years. These claims suggest that alleged relationships were not limited to men, but included women as well, long before the public was ever invited into that conversation.
As this narrative gained traction, screenshots resurfaced. Old reality show moments were replayed. Party footage that once seemed playful or inconsequential suddenly looked different when viewed through a new lens. Interactions that had been brushed off as jokes or speculation were now being re-examined as potential pieces of a much larger puzzle. And that's when the tone of the conversation shifted. This is where Tasha K enters the story and fundamentally changes the direction of the narrative. Rather than framing Porsha's comments as brave or empowering, Tasha positioned them as overdue and possibly strategic. According to her claims, what Porsha was now describing as healing had allegedly been visible to people close to her for years, not as growth, but as a pattern. A pattern, she claimed, that included emotional distance in relationships, unexplained separations, and alleged intimacy with women long before the public narrative changed. What made this moment especially volatile wasn't just the allegation itself, it was the timing. Just days after the internet applauded Porsha for finding herself, critics began pointing out something unsettling. Her words sounded less like discovery and more like justification. Instead of addressing rumors directly, the narrative leaned heavily into emotion, loneliness, pain, exhaustion, vulnerability. According to media analysts, this is a well-known redirection tactic. When explanation becomes risky, emotion often replaces accountability. You don't deny, you don't confirm, you humanize. And for a brief moment, it worked. Clips of Porsha's interview spread rapidly across social media, and supporters flooded comment sections with praise. But at the same time, something else was unfolding quietly in the background.
Old footage resurfaced, reality show moments were re-examined, party clips from years ago were shared again, now viewed through a very different lens. According to sources familiar with production environments, there were long-standing conversations about Porsha's behavior that never made it to air, conversations about boundaries, blurred lines, and cast members who allegedly felt uncomfortable but chose to remain silent to avoid backlash. These stories were never confirmed, never denied, and never addressed publicly. They simply stayed buried until now. As these conversations resurfaced, the narrative began to darken even further. Tasha K's commentary didn't stop at alleged infidelity. She introduced something far more serious, claims involving undisclosed health risks and lack of transparency. According to her allegations, some people close to Porsha were privately concerned not just about cheating, but about potential exposure and whether everyone involved was fully informed. To be absolutely clear, no documents have been released, no medical records have surfaced, none of these claims have been proven. However, the allegation alone was enough to completely change the tone of the conversation. This was no longer about sexuality, it became about responsibility. According to circulating claims, questions were raised behind the scenes and allegedly minimized or ignored. And if even a fraction of these allegations were true, critics argue, the issue wouldn't be about who someone loves, it would be about trust and transparency. That's when the internet split. One side of the audience believes Tasha K is reckless, exploiting a sensitive situation for attention. They point to her history of controversial commentary and legal issues as evidence that this is clout chasing rather than truth. The other side believes something feels different this time, not louder, not messier, but heavier. They argue that these rumors didn't appear overnight. They've existed for years and were simply given new oxygen once Porsha opened the door herself. And in an era where archived footage and digital memory never fade, narratives don't disappear, they wait. Legal experts have already begun speculating about potential fallout, not because anything has been proven, but because of what's being implied. In situations like this, the usual next steps are clear: cease and desist letters, official denials, or legal action. And yet, there has been none of that. No lawsuits, no firm denials, no clarifications, just silence. And silence in moments like this is never neutral. While official statements remain absent, speculation grows louder, fear grows louder. Fear that more footage exists, fear that private messages could surface, fear that people who once stayed quiet may decide they are no longer willing to protect someone else's reputation. Porsha positioned herself as healing, Tasha positioned herself as exposing, and the audience is left in the middle, trying to decide which version feels closer to the truth. Because the most disturbing question remains unanswered. If all of this is false, why hasn't it been shut down?
As the conversation continued, critics revisited something even more uncomfortable: Porsha's past public statements, including archived footage where she appeared to preach against LGBTQ identities, framing them as something to be prayed over or corrected. Side-by-side comparisons flooded social media, contrasting those sermons with her current statements about fluidity and self-reflection. Supporters argue that people grow and belief systems evolve. Skeptics argue that growth requires acknowledgement and accountability requires clarity, neither of which has been offered. Instead, what followed was silence and a newly framed narrative that some feel conveniently reframed years of rumors into a personal awakening. According to sources familiar with the situation, the whispers about alleged relationships with women did not originate from fans, but from industry insiders, production staff, and people within the same circles. Again, nothing has been proven, but consistency raises eyebrows. Analysts note that when allegations reach this stage, where implications matter more than proof, the silence becomes strategic. If evidence were weak,
denials would be swift. If everything were false, corrections would be aggressive. Instead, there is nothing, and that nothing has only intensified curiosity. Observers warn that partial disclosure is risky. Tell part of the story, and others will fill in the rest, especially in an era where digital memory never fades. What makes this story dangerous isn't the allegations themselves, it's the silence that follows them. Silence isn't neutral. It isn't accidental. It's a choice. And when that choice is made while contradictions remain unresolved, people start looking elsewhere for answers. That's where the internet becomes not a court, but a memory bank, a place where old footage doesn't disappear, where past statements don't expire, and where narratives don't reset just because someone wants them to. This was never just about sexuality, it was never just about rumors, and it was never just one interview. It's about trust, transparency, and what happens when public figures demand understanding without offering clarity. So the real question isn't whether you believe everything you've heard. The question is far more uncomfortable. If none of this matters, why does it keep coming back? If none of it is true, why hasn't it been shut down? And if even part of it is, how long can it stay buried? Because history has taught us one thing. Stories like this don't disappear. They evolve. They wait. And when they resurface, they rarely ask permission. We'll keep watching. We'll keep tracking what's said and what isn't. Because some truths don't announce themselves loudly. They wait.